Right, so hello and welcome back to Books and Things, and welcome to another Victober video. Today I'm going to be talking about some great and slightly underrated novels by some quite well-known Victorian authors. This month I'll also be doing a video on lesser well-known Victorian authors, because there are a lot of Victorian authors who are very underrated and really forgotten about. But what I wanted to talk about today was some very brilliant novels by some very famous authors, but they're not necessarily the novels that you immediately think of when you think of that author, and they tend to be a bit overlooked in comparison to the author's other books. One of our challenges for Victober this year, Anne's challenges, was to read a lesser known Victorian book, and we said as a rough guide for that, like under 12,000 ratings on Goodreads was lesser well known. Not all of these books have under 12,000 ratings on Goodreads, though a lot of them do. A lot of the books I will be talking about have very low ratings on Goodreads in comparison to other books by the same author. Let's start off, of course, with Charles Dickens. Charles Dickens is one of the most famous novelists of the Victorian period, arguably the most famous novelist of the Victorian period. He's pretty well known, but for a man who wrote 14 and a half books and a lot of shorter works, the ones that are mostly heard about are Great Expectations, Oliver Twist, A Tale of Two Cities. Sometimes David Copperfield, sometimes Bleak House, but that's still only a fairly small proportion of his work. And there are 3 novels and a shorter work by him that I do want to mention today that I very much adore and think are very underrated. One is his novel Dombey and Son. This has about 10,000 ratings on Goodreads, which is not a lot, especially when you consider that Charles Dickens' most rated book on Goodreads, A Tale of Two Cities, has 600,000 ratings. This is very underrated because this is much better than A Tale of Two Cities, and better than like all Dickens books apart from Our Mutual Friend. This is a thoroughly wonderful book. Dombey and Son follows the character of Florence Dombey. At the beginning of the book, her little brother is born, and Florence lives with her father and her little brother, and her father runs a company called Dombey and Son. He adores his son because his son is the future of his company, but he cares nothing for girls because daughters and women mean nothing to him in comparison to his company and the fact that he has a son, so he very much neglects his daughter Florence because she is a girl rather than a boy. And the book explores the effect this has on Florence, how it affects her life and how it changes her relationship with her father and all of those around her. It's a really fascinating exploration of gender in the Victorian period, and all in all is a thoroughly brilliant book. I also want to mention Charles Dickens' Little Dorrit. This is a bit better known and has 36,000 ratings on Goodreads, but still not very much in comparison to A Tale of Two Cities. Little Dorrit is a thoroughly brilliant book, and it is one of my favourite Dickens. It's probably my 3rd favourite Dickens. It follows the character of Amy Dorrit, who lives with her father in the Marshalsea debtors prison because her father is in debt. She goes out to work as a seamstress and kind of a servant, not telling anyone where she lives and where her home is. One day the son of her employee, a man called Mr. Clenham, follows her home and discovers where she lives and finds out about her, and the book follows her friendship with Arthur Clenham as well as a whole heap of subplots around them. It is really interesting, a brilliant book. Deals fascinatingly with themes of money and class and respectability, has probably my favourite love story in Dickens, and is all in all well worth your time. I also feel I should mention Our Mutual Friend because it only has 20,000 ratings on Goodreads, which is not that many. However, I also am aware that although I think Our Mutual Friend is like lesser well known and underrated within the wider world, it is not underrated or nor lesser well known within my channel, in that I talk about it in like nearly every video, so I won't say much about it here. Apart from that, it is the best book ever written and very good, and my favourite novel, and I would highly recommend it. It's a brilliant book about Victorian London, about class and money and morality and deception and so many brilliant things. And then the 4th Dickens thing I wanted to mention was a Christmas story of his, and that is his story The Cricket on the Hearth. A Christmas Carol is obviously incredibly well known. In fact, on Goodreads I think it has like 450,000 ratings. The Cricket on the Hearth has barely 4,000, but it is a brilliant story and one I would highly recommend. I love it, probably not quite as much as A Christmas Carol, but I do love it a lot. I think it's a really enjoyable, engaging story, and one I would highly recommend, and it was written as a Christmas story, so perhaps it's worth a read this Christmas. It looks very interestingly at a marriage and has a really tender portrait of the relationship between a particular couple, which I really enjoy. Next, I want to mention 2 novels by the author Charlotte Bronte, another incredibly well-known Victorian author, known chiefly from her novel Jane Eyre, which has over 1 million ratings on Goodreads because Jane Eyre is pretty widely read. But Charlotte Bronte also wrote 3 other novels which are well worth a read, and there are 2 in particular that I'd like to recommend that I think are very underrated. One is Villette. This is a bit more widely read. It has like 48,000 1,000 ratings on Goodreads, but still nothing in comparison to Jane Eyre. The other is Shirley, which has about 24,000 ratings on Goodreads. Villette is one of my all-time favourite Victorian novels, one of my all-time favourite novels. It's absolutely brilliant, and I think if you're someone that likes Jane Eyre but finds certain things about it a little bit problematic or a little bit irritating, then Villette is definitely one for you. It follows the character of Lucy Snow, who moves to Belgium in order to find herself a teaching position, ends up first as a kind of nursery governess and then as a teacher in a school, and it's about her life there, her loneliness, how she feels as an outsider in this town where she is a foreigner, and her relationship with the different people that she meets in this town. It's a book about unrequited love and loneliness and depression, but also a book about hope and building a life for yourself out of hopeless situations, and it is just thoroughly, thoroughly brilliant. Shirley is another great book and one I would highly recommend. It's a bit more industrial than the rest of Bronte's novels, which is really, really interesting. Set in an area where there's quite a lot of mills, and one of the characters it follows, Robert Moore, is a mill owner. But chiefly we follow a young woman called Caroline and her best friend Shirley. It's a really, really interesting book, very interesting in terms of gender and the presentation of Caroline and Shirley. I would highly, highly recommend it. Next, I have a few works by Elizabeth Gaskell to recommend. She is a fairly well-known Victorian author, chiefly for North and South, which has about 100,000 ratings on Goodreads, but I want to talk about three of her lesser well-known works which I think are highly worth a read. One is her novel Ruth, which has about 5,000 ratings on Goodreads. So as I have said about Ruth before, imagine Tess the D'Urbervilles, written by someone who had a belief in like humanity and the goodness in the world. It follows a young woman called Ruth who ends up in a compromising situation with a young man outside of wedlock, and kind of everything that goes on from there, and the life that she manages to lead despite this kind of blot on her respectability and on her reputation. It's a really, really thoroughly interesting book, a very interesting exploration of religion and self-identity and relationships and surrogate families and the kind of families that people build from chance encounters. Really, really brilliant, and I would highly recommend. I'd also recommend Gaskell's book Sylvia's Lovers, which has about 3,000 ratings on Goodreads. Also underrated, but a really, really brilliant book and one I'm very, very fond of. It follows a woman called Sylvia and the two men who are interested in her, one of whom is one she has known from childhood and is good friends with but doesn't necessarily feel much passion for, and another is a handsome sailor who she doesn't know very well but is much more taken with. The book looks at what happens in her relationships with these two men and also examines a lot of really interesting historical things going on in the 1790s when it's set, including the Napoleonic Wars and the press gangs abducting young men to take them into the Navy. It's a really, really interesting book and highly worth a read. And the other Gaskell book I would like to recommend is her novella A Dark Night's Work, which has less than 150 ratings on Goodreads and is absolutely awesome. I have done a full video on all three of these, A Dark Night's Work, Ruth and Sylvia's Lovers, quite recently in my 2 weeks of Elizabeth Gaskell, so I'll link them down below as well. But A Dark Night's Work is wonderful, it's thoroughly exciting. It's about a young woman called Eleanor who lives with her father. She's met a young man, she's fallen in love, everything's going well, and then one dark night a thing happens and nothing will ever be the same again. It is a brilliant, exciting, wonderful read and I would highly, highly recommend it. I then have a few Thomas Hardy books to recommend. Thomas Hardy is obviously a very, very well-known Victorian author. I think Tess the D'Urbervilles has nearly 200,000 ratings on Goodreads, and I feel like a lot of people who haven't read Tess have still heard of it, but there are quite a few of his books that are much, much lesser well-known but that I would highly, highly recommend. One is his novel The Woodlanders, which I think has about 12,000 ratings on Goodreads, and this is a thoroughly, thoroughly brilliant book, absolutely one of my favourite Hardys. I have done an individual video on this and the other two I'll talk about in my 2 weeks of Thomas Hardy back in whenever it was I did that. But I would really highly recommend The Woodlanders. It is a brilliant book. It follows a character called Grace and the men who are interested in her. Hardy is the master of the love triangle or the love quartet, and this book is no exception. It is really, really brilliant, really moving, really poignant, and definitely a wonderful, wonderful read. It has that Hardy quality of brilliance that is inexplainable that you get in so many of his really, really well-known books like Tess the D'Urbervilles or Far from the Madding Crowd or The Mayor of Casterbridge or Jude the Obscure, but somehow The Woodlanders is much lesser well-known, and I really don't know why, because it's marvellous. And two other very underrated Thomas Hardy novels. One is The Hand of Ethelberta. This has, I think, under 3,000 ratings on Goodreads, but I really, really enjoy. It's quite dramatic, quite pacey, a bit more sensationalist than some of Thomas Hardy's other novels. It follows a woman called Ethelberta who has managed to get into the class that she was not born in. She is now a lady because she happened to marry a gentleman, but her parents are servants, and the book basically follows her effort to keep this a secret and her effort to remarry since the death of her husband. Really, really interesting and definitely worth a read. And then another Hardy book, another one of my favourites, is Desperate Remedies. This has just like 2,000 ratings on Goodreads, but it is so good and definitely needs much more attention than it gets. It was Thomas Hardy's first novel and it's very dramatic. It's a great page turner of a Victorian novel, which is one reason why I would highly recommend it. It follows a young woman called Cytherea. Hardy does like her unusual names, and what happens to her and her brother after their father dies and they're left without very much money, and also what happens with the two different men that are interested in Cytherea, and also with Cytherea's new mistress at her new work, who is also called Cytherea. Very dramatic, very page-turnery, really exciting and well worth a read. Then I have one George Eliot novel I would like to recommend, and that is her book Daniel Deronda. George Eliot is another one of the Victorians' most well-known authors. I think Middlemarch, which is probably her best read book, has about 100,000 ratings on Goodreads, but Daniel Deronda is really underrated in comparison, and I really like Daniel Deronda and would really highly recommend it. It's also a very interesting Victorian novel for being quite different, and one of the things that is quite different about it is that it deals very much with issues of what it was like to be Jewish in the 19th century, which is not something that is dealt with in that many Victorian novels. It follows two characters, Daniel and Gwendolyn, and the various events that go on in their lives and lead their lives to intertwine in some way. It's a really brilliant read, deals with a lot of interesting and quite unique themes, and one I would highly recommend. I would also like to recommend a play by Oscar Wilde, A Woman of No Importance, which is one of my favourite things by Oscar Wilde, and a really brilliant, really interestingly feminist play with a lot of really interesting messages and a really interesting look at reputation and women in the Victorian period. It has about 8,000 ratings on Goodreads, which in comparison to A Picture of Dorian Gray with nearly 700,000 and The Importance of Being Earnest, his most famous play, with about 240,000, A Woman of No Importance is really underrated and definitely worth a read. Sorry about all the numbers, I really like numbers, but anyway, so I think those are all of the books that I wanted to recommend today. Quite a long list, but hopefully you have found some interesting reads amongst here. Please let me know down in the comments if you have any other books to recommend that are lesser well-known books by well-known Victorian authors. There are a couple of well-known Victorian authors that are not on this list because I have only read their well-known stuff, such as Sir Arthur Conan Doyle or Wilkie Collins. I'd be especially interested to hear about some lesser well-known works by them. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll be back very soon with another bookish video.